In 1948, as the National Party took power in South Africa, the world witnessed the beginnings of one of history's most oppressive systems of segregation, the infamous apartheid. But how was this horrid system of segregation brought about? The answer lies in the late 19th century South African conflict between farmers of Dutch descent, known as Boers, and British imperialists. The conflict culminated into two bloody Anglo-Boer wars fought between two different lifestyles, the simple agrarian Boer way of life and the materialistic imperialist British mindset. Ultimately, a compromise was reached, in which the Boers gained considerable control over the internal South African government in exchange for the support of the unification of South Africa under the British Crown. However, this compromise resulted in a similar conflict between the Boers and the black natives over the next 50 years, in which the Boers manipulated legislative power to oppress the black natives in the system known as apartheid. The Boers of South Africa descended from Dutch sailors who settled in the mid-1600s. While trying to reach India and the lucrative Spice Islands, these sailors were left shipwrecked and confined to the Cape of Good Hope, awaiting rescue. They soon decided to settle in the area due to the abundance of natural resources and materials, and thus Cape Colony was founded. The settlers exploited the environment and enslaved many indigenous people. Outside the limits of Cape Colony were vast areas of prime farmland, leading many Dutch to settle further inland and permanently adopt agrarian lifestyles. These settlers were fittingly given the name Boer, the Dutch word for farmer. However, the Boers were not the only settlers in South Africa. British settlers joined them nearly 200 years later. Britain gained control of the Dutch colony and proceeded to settle in the area in 1820, seeking the economic benefits of favorable trade and abundant resources. This new regime looked to assert its dominance over the Boer settlers, immediately establishing rule over much of the Boer population. However, the imperialist goals of the British didn't mix well with the rural agrarian lifestyle of the Boers.
The Boers felt that the colonial government, which gave very little power, if at all, to the Boers, that this colonial power didn't act in their interest and didn't listen to their grievances and so forth.
As a result, the Boers began to migrate further and further inland, away from the British-controlled territory in a mass migration known as the Great Trek. Settling inland, they formed two independent Boer republics, the Transvaal State and the Orange Free State. This geographical separation allowed the Boers and the British to remain at an uneasy peace with each other for 60 years. This unstable peace ended in 1880 with the First Anglo-Boer War. With the discovery of gold in the Transvaal Republic in the mid-1870s, the British became much more interested in taking control of the Boer states. However, when the British tried to annex Boer territory in 1880, war broke out. The Boers ultimately defeated the British forces and signed favorable deals during the Pretoria Convention in 1881 and the London Convention in 1884. While these resolutions resolved political differences, they failed to relieve social tensions. And less than 20 years later, a much more bloody and brutal war, the Second Anglo-Boer War, began. The British, fearful of a Boer plot against them, lined up troops on the borders of the Transvaal and Orange Free States. The Boer states responded with an ultimatum requiring Britain to withdraw. Britain refused, and once again war broke out in 1899. Despite initial Boer success, the well-trained and equipped British forces dominated. By June of 1900, the British had captured the Transvaal capital, Pretoria, and were on the verge of winning the war. Some Boers accepted defeat, but others reverted to guerrilla warfare, further extending the war for almost 2 years. In order to combat the guerrilla tactics, the British adopted a scorched earth policy, burning farms, houses, railroads, and supply lines to the ground. This was particularly devastating to the Boer people, leaving many poor and homeless. As Boer men died on the battlefield, women and children were sent to concentration camps.
And because these Boers who were on their farms were now collected together, there were epidemics breaking out. And by the end of the war, 28,000 Boers, women and children, had been dead.
The Second Boer War officially ended in 1902 with the signing of the Treaty of Vereeniging. The Transvaal State and the Orange Free State were immediately made colonies of the British Empire, but they were put on a path of eventual self-governance. However, the more historically significant compromise took place during the creation of the South African Union in 1910. The Transvaal Republic, the Orange Free State, and the previously British Cape Colony and Natal Colony were all under the same rule, marking an opportunity for the British to establish more effective economic control by unifying the region. However, the Boers preferred their own autonomy over British rule, and the success and integrity of a unified South African state depended on Boer support. Fortunately for the British, the Boers longed for political power in the region, and the British were more than happy to give them just that. The British gave the Boers the majority of control in the newly formed legislature, in exchange for their support of the South African Union. Several other factors played into Britain's swift political exit from South Africa. One especially important one was the British media's coverage of the war. Activists like Emily Hobhouse exposed the harsh treatment of Boers by the British during the Second Boer War, showing to the people of mainland Britain the atrocities that their empire was committing against innocent Boers in Cape Colony.
Emily Hobhouse is one of the chief critics of the British war machinery. So, the greatest threat to British imperialism comes not from the Afrikaners, but from the British treatment of the Afrikaners.
British settlers still maintained several economic connections through control of mining resources, but played a minimal political role from that point onwards. The Boers suffered immensely from the Second Boer War. Homes and farms were burned to the ground as the Boer way of life was severely threatened. This prompted an extreme response afterwards by the Boers.
And this brought an aggressive Afrikaner nationalism, a kind of attitude that we will never suffer again. And unfortunately, in this process, they started with a system of segregation.
This system of segregation marked the start of a new conflict, one that in many ways resembled the conflict that caused it. The Boer-supported government had several implications on the social order in South Africa. The Boers took political control and thus gained social supremacy. The black natives remained at the bottom rung of the social ladder. The Boer minority was determined to suppress the native black majority. It began with the passage of the Land Act in 1913, which prevented blacks from owning land within certain parts of Cape Town. Soon thereafter, other laws prevented blacks from obtaining certain high-paying jobs. And once Britain granted South Africa total constitutional independence in 1933, the government passed even more laws disenfranchising blacks, such as the Native Representation Act in 1936, forcing blacks to vote for only white representatives. By 1948, the National Party took power and ushered in the era of apartheid, during which black people were systematically segregated and deprived of basic rights. These policies brought many black people into a world of intense poverty, moving the black populations out of cities and into rural ghettos. This ensured that black people couldn't access better jobs in the cities. It also ensured that a physical separation between whites and blacks would remain. Black people also received very little pay, so parents spend most of their time away from the home, working to make a living for their families while leaving their children to grow up with little support.
Black men had to go from rural areas to go and work in the towns. And this meant that a household was broken up. Kids grow up without a father. And a mother has to work somewhere as a, let's say, a domestic servant to have money for her and her children. So the children are left at home. And therefore the children grow up with a loose, broken black culture society.
These harsh policies did not come without grassroots resistance. The blacks fought back, forming the South African Natives Congress, which later became the African National Congress, tirelessly advocating for their rights in society. They led numerous mass protests and organized riots, refusing to remain complacent. The Boers dominated the conflict for so long, however, that the apartheid continued until the early 1990s. Throughout South African history, two major conflicts forever shaped the future of the region: the Boers against the British imperialists, and later, the blacks against the Boers. These two conflicts share many haunting similarities. The apartheid was a long-fought conflict between the ruling Boer minority and the oppressed black majority, passing laws threatening black autonomy and rights. Similarly, when the British first came to South Africa, they were vastly outnumbered by the Boer peoples, yet they too subjugated the Boers and instituted laws interfering with the very livelihood of the Boers. Both conflicts manifested themselves into brutal wars, a physical war in the case of the Anglo-Boer Wars, and a social one in the case of the apartheid. Likewise, the impact of these wars were related to the exhibition. The Boers were left physically devastated as a result of the Anglo-Boer Wars, their farms damaged and their fellow brothers and sisters dead at the hands of the British, and the blacks were left socially devastated as a result of the apartheid, suffering in extreme poverty without basic civil rights or a voice in their own governance. In between these two conflicts came the pivotal compromise, the creation of the Union of South Africa, the platform that ended the Anglo-Boer Wars and soon gave rise to the infamous apartheid.